This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome, curious listeners. Have you ever wondered why humans are the only species on Earth with a prominent chin? It's one of those peculiar features we rarely think about, yet it sets us apart from every other primate, even our closest extinct relatives. Today, we're diving into this evolutionary mystery, exploring the surprising theories about why this bony protrusion emerged in our lineage, from biomechanics to mate selection. Whether it's a functional adaptation or simply a quirk of our evolution, the story of the human chin is far more fascinating than you might expect. Chapter 1. Ours Alone. Take a moment to run your finger along the front of your lower jaw, just below your lower lip. That protrusion of bone you feel jutting forward, extending anywhere from 0.7 of a centimeter to just over a centimeter from your face, is something extraordinary. It's a feature so commonplace that most of us never give it a second thought. Yet it represents one of the most puzzling and distinctive characteristics separating modern humans from every other creature that has ever lived on Earth. We are the only species, living or extinct, to possess a true chin. This might seem like a trivial observation at first. After all, when we look at other animals, many appear to have something chin-like. We scratch our dogs under what we casually call their chin. We notice the distinctive profile of a bulldog's lower jaw. But these aren't true chins in the anatomical sense. What humans possess is fundamentally different, and understanding this difference is crucial to appreciating just how unusual we really are. In anatomical terms, a true chin is defined as a bony projection extending forward from the lower jaw, specifically from the mental region of the mandible, beyond the plane of the front teeth. It's not simply a lower jaw or a jawbone, which all vertebrates with jaws possess. It's a distinctive, forward-pointing prominence at the very front and bottom of the face. Some researchers describe it more precisely as an inverted T-shaped structure, featuring a triangular projection at the base of the jaw, a vertical midline ridge called a keel, and small depressions on either side. This exact combination of features appears only in modern humans. The chin, properly called the mental protuberance or mental eminence by anatomists, may seem like a small measurement, but in evolutionary terms, it's a dramatic departure from the design seen in every other mammal. The structure often continues laterally on each side as a thickening along the lower edge of the jaw. In some individuals, each lateral extremity of this mental protuberance forms a distinct corner, referred to as a mental tubercle. Above each of these lateral areas, and to either side of the central prominence, lies a depression known as the mental fossa, which exists essentially because the midline bone is elevated while the areas beside it are not. When we examine our closest living relatives, the great apes, the absence of this feature becomes immediately apparent. Look at the skull of a chimpanzee, our nearest evolutionary cousin, and you'll see that the lower jaw slopes backward from the front teeth. There's no forward projection, no bony knob at the bottom of the face. The same is true for gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons. Their mandibles may be massive and powerful, but they lack the peculiar forward thrust that characterizes the human face. Detailed studies of modern apes confirm that only humans possess the suite of characteristics that define a true chin. This distinction becomes even more striking when we consider extinct human relatives. The Neanderthals, who lived in Europe and Asia roughly 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, had many features in common with modern humans. They had large brains, in fact larger on average than ours. They made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, and cared for their sick and elderly. They buried their dead. By many measures, they were remarkably human-like. Yet when you examine a Neanderthal skull, one difference stands out immediately. The Neanderthal jaw ends in a flat vertical plane or slopes backward. There is no chin. The same is true for every other extinct member of the human family tree that scientists have identified. Homo erectus, who lived for more than 1.5 million years and spread from Africa across much of Asia, lacked a chin. Homo heidelbergensis, once thought to be a common ancestor of both modern humans and Neanderthals, had no chin. The Denisovans, mysterious relatives known primarily from DNA and a handful of fossils found in Siberian caves, left no evidence of having chins. Even specimens that lived much more recently, who in many ways resembled modern humans, sometimes lacked this feature. This creates a fascinating puzzle in the fossil record. The appearance of the chin in the fossil record provides crucial evidence about human evolution. The oldest known remains of Homo sapiens, found at Jebel Himhoud in Morocco and dated to approximately 300,000 years ago, show a mixture of ancient and modern traits. The skulls have some archaic features like a long brain case and strong brow ridges, but also more modern characteristics such as a flatter face and thinner jawbones. As we move forward in time, examining fossils from sites in Ethiopia like Omo Kibish and Herto, dated to around 200,000 years ago, we see that a more rounded brain case had developed. And crucially, we begin to see the distinctive chin morphology that characterizes modern humans. But the chin isn't just absent from other primates and extinct hominids. With rare and debatable exceptions, it's absent from all other mammals as well. Elephants and manatees have sometimes been mentioned as having chin-like structures, but upon closer examination, these don't qualify as true chins. The elephant's lower jaw does have a forward-projecting element, but it's part of a completely different facial architecture, designed to support the trunk and massive tusks. The manatee's jaw structure serves the needs of an aquatic herbivore, crushing and grinding aquatic vegetation. Neither represents the same kind of bony prominence seen in humans. They're different anatomical structures that happen to create a superficial resemblance to what we might casually call a chin, but they lack the specific inverted T morphology and developmental pattern that defines the true chin. This uniqueness extends across the entire mammalian family tree. No species of bat, whale, rodent, carnivore, or ungulate possesses anything like a human chin. Not among the living, and not in the fossil record. This is particularly striking when you consider that mammals have evolved an extraordinary diversity of jaw shapes and sizes to suit different diets and lifestyles. Carnivores have powerful jaws with long canine teeth for seizing prey. Herbivores have grinding molars for processing plant material. Beavers have chisel-like incisors for gnawing wood. Each of these represents an adaptation to a specific way of life, yet none resulted in the development of a chin. The recognition that humans alone possess chins dates back centuries. In 1775, the naturalist Johann Friedrich Blumenbach identified the chin as among the most fundamental features distinguishing humans from other primates. At that time, the study of human origins was still in its infancy, and the idea that humans had evolved from earlier forms was not yet accepted. But Blumenbach recognized that the chin represented something distinctive about human anatomy. For modern researchers, identifying whether a fossil specimen has a chin isn't always straightforward, particularly when dealing with fragmentary remains. Paleontologists look for specific features. They examine whether the bone at the front of the jaw projects forward beyond the teeth. They look for the mental trigone, that triangular pattern formed by the central prominence and lateral tubercles. They check for the characteristic depressions on either side. They measure the angle of the symphysis, the region where the two halves of the lower jaw join together. Some researchers have focused specifically on juvenile specimens when trying to identify the presence of a chin, because they've found that differences among adults in how prominent a chin appears can be developmental variations. A person with a small, less prominent chin still has the underlying bony structure that defines the feature. The difference in prominence develops as the face grows through childhood and adolescence. By studying very young individuals, researchers can identify the fundamental pattern without the complications introduced by later growth. This developmental pattern has proven useful for researchers trying to understand when the chin evolved. By examining juvenile specimens from the fossil record, they can identify the presence or absence of the characteristic features without the complications introduced by adult variation. Very small fragments of the symphysis from perinatal individuals can be identified as human or non-human based on these distinctive features. The absence of chins in our closest relatives creates a stark dividing line in human evolution. It's one of the features that allows paleontologists to confidently identify a fossil as belonging to Homo sapiens rather than to an earlier or different species. When researchers find a lower jaw in the fossil record, one of the first things they examine is the symphyseal region. Does it slope backward, remain vertical, or project forward? Is there a mental prominence? Are there lateral tubercles? The answers to these questions help determine where that specimen fits in the human family tree. But this diagnostic value also creates complications. Because the chin appears to be unique to Homo sapiens among all the hominids in our family tree, its presence or absence has sometimes been used as the sole criterion for classifying fossils as modern human or something else. Yet the timing and manner in which the chin evolved remains a subject of ongoing investigation. Some fossil discoveries have challenged our understanding further. In July 2025, researchers published a study examining a child's skull and jaw from roughly 140,000 years ago. The skull shows distinct Homo sapiens features, but the lower jaw has Neanderthal characteristics, including the absence of a chin. The researchers suggested this might represent a child with mixed Neanderthal and Homo sapiens heritage. If confirmed, this would indicate that the two species could interbreed and produce fertile offspring, which we now know from genetic evidence they could. But it also shows how the chin, or lack thereof, appears in the context of hybridization between different human species. The chin's uniqueness poses a fundamental evolutionary question. When a trait appears in multiple species, especially when those species aren't closely related, it usually suggests that the trait serves some useful purpose. Wings, for instance, evolved independently in birds, bats, and insects because flight provides clear survival advantages. Eyes evolved independently multiple times because vision is enormously useful. But the chin appears only in one species, and only recently in evolutionary terms. This pattern suggests either that the chin serves a purpose so specific to modern human lifestyles that no other creature needed it, or that it's not actually an adaptation at all, but rather a byproduct of other changes. The fact that we can examine this feature across the full range of human diversity today provides another perspective. All modern humans, regardless of their ancestry or where their populations have lived, possess chins. The exact prominence varies considerably. Some people have strong, jutting chins, while others have smaller, less pronounced ones. Some have cleft chins, with a distinctive dimple in the center, while others have smooth chins. But the underlying bony structure is always present. This universality suggests that the chin evolved before modern human populations dispersed across the globe, probably somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago in Africa. When we consider what makes humans unique among all animals, we usually think of our large brains, our capacity for language, our tool use, our culture. These are profound differences that have allowed humans to become the dominant species on the planet, for better or worse. The chin seems trivial by comparison, yet it's precisely because the chin seems so unimportant that its uniqueness is so puzzling. Why would natural selection produce this feature in humans and humans alone? Or did natural selection produce it at all? These questions have driven more than a century of scientific investigation and debate, and, as we'll see, researchers still disagree about the answers. What we can say with certainty is that the chin defines us as a species in a way that few other traits do. It's visible, measurable, and unambiguous. It appears in the fossil record at a particular time, marking a transition from archaic to modern human anatomy. It separates us from our evolutionary cousins, both living and extinct. When you touch your chin, you're touching a piece of bone that tells a story about who we are and where we came from, even if we're still working out exactly what that story means. Chapter 2. A Century of Certainty Crumbles. For most of the last century, if you asked a paleoanthropologist why humans have chins, you'd likely receive a confident answer. The chin evolved to strengthen the jaw against the forces of chewing. It seemed to make perfect sense. Humans have powerful jaw muscles, and when we bite down on tough food, tremendous forces concentrate at the front of the lower jaw. Surely that bony protrusion at the bottom of our face must serve some mechanical purpose, providing structural reinforcement at a critical stress point. This explanation appeared so logical, so satisfying in its simplicity, that it became the dominant theory and was repeated in textbooks and scientific papers for generations. The reasoning went something like this. When you bite down on food, your jaw acts as a lever system, with muscles pulling in one direction and teeth pressing in another. These opposing forces create stress in the bone, particularly at the front of the jaw where the two halves of the mandible join together in what's called the symphysis. Over millennia of human evolution, as our ancestors chewed increasingly tough foods, the individuals whose jaws could best withstand these stresses would have had an advantage. They could eat a wider variety of foods, extract more nutrition, and ultimately survive better to pass on their genes. Through this process of natural selection, the theory proposed, the chin gradually emerged as a biomechanical adaptation, a structural buttress that made the front of the jaw more resistant to the forces of chewing. This explanation had historical weight behind it. As early as 1911, a researcher named Alice Hrdlicka suggested that the chin developed through mechanical forces acting on the jaw. 2 years later, in 1913, Lewis Robinson proposed that the demand to resist masticatory stresses triggered bone thickening in the mental region of the mandible, ultimately forming a prominent chin. Decades later, in 1954, other researchers proposed that the chin developed to resist what they called wishboning forces, a specific type of stress that occurs when you bite down hard on one side of your mouth. The name comes from the way these forces would tend to bend the jaw like a wishbone, creating tension on the outer surface of the symphysis. In 1993, David Daegling advanced this thinking further, explaining the chin as a functional adaptation specifically to resist vertical bending stresses in the coronal plane, the imaginary slice that divides your head into front and back portions. Some researchers drew comparisons to other primates. Apes like chimpanzees and gorillas have powerful jaws and large teeth for processing tough plant materials, yet they don't have chins. Instead, many apes have what's called a simian shelf, a plate of bone on the inside of the jaw that acts as an internal buttress. The thinking was that as human ancestors evolved, they lost the simian shelf and developed the external chin instead, solving the same structural problem with a different architectural solution. It was an elegant idea that seemed to explain both why we have chins and why our ape relatives don't. Other researchers proposed an alternative mechanical explanation. Perhaps the chin evolved not to resist chewing forces, but to absorb impacts from blows to the face. After all, we do sometimes talk about someone taking it on the chin, and the chin is certainly positioned where it could potentially receive punches or other impacts. Perhaps early humans fought frequently enough that individuals with chins, which might serve as a kind of protective crumple zone, had a survival advantage over those without. Both the chewing hypothesis and the impact protection hypothesis seemed plausible. Both offered clear adaptive explanations for why the chin might have evolved. But in the early years of the 21st century, researchers at the University of Iowa decided to actually test the chewing hypothesis rather than simply accepting it. Nathan Holton, an anthropologist who studies craniofacial features and mechanics, collaborated with colleagues to conduct one of the most comprehensive biomechanical analyses of the human chin ever attempted. What they discovered would challenge more than a century of accepted wisdom and force scientists to fundamentally reconsider why we have chins at all. The Iowa team had access to an extraordinary resource, the Iowa Facial Growth Study, a longitudinal project that had tracked the skull development of children from age 3 into adulthood, taking regular X-rays throughout their growth. This provided a rare window into how the chin develops over time in real individuals, not just theoretical models. The researchers selected 37 people from this study, 18 females and 19 males, and analyzed 292 precise measurements taken at different points in their development. This provided a rare window into how the chin develops over time in real individuals, not just theoretical models. Using advanced biomechanical analysis techniques, the team calculated exactly how much stress different types of chewing would place on various parts of the jaw. They focused on two main forces that had been proposed as the primary drivers of chin evolution. The first was vertical bending, which occurs when you bite down and the vertical portions of your jaw, called the ramus on each side, splay outward slightly. This creates tension in the symphysial area at the front of the jaw. Imagine holding a horseshoe by the two ends and pulling them apart slightly. The bottom of the curve would experience stress. That's roughly what happens to your jaw during vertical bending. The second force was wishboning, named for its similarity to breaking a wishbone. This occurs when you bite down hard on one side of your mouth. The force pulls that side of the jaw outward, creating compression on the outer surface of the chin and tension on the inner surface. If you've ever broken a wishbone, you know how it bends before it snaps. A similar bending, though much smaller in magnitude, occurs in your jaw when you chew asymmetrically. According to the chewing hypothesis, these forces should stimulate bone growth in the chin region. As people grew from toddlers to adults, progressively chewing more and tougher foods, the mechanical stresses should trigger the deposition of new bone, making the chin more and more prominent. The individuals who experience the greatest chewing forces should develop the most prominent chins. It was a testable prediction, and that's exactly what made it vulnerable to being proven wrong. When the researchers analyzed their data, they found something completely unexpected. There was no relationship between mechanical stress and chin prominence. None whatsoever. In fact, the data suggested the opposite of what the chewing hypothesis predicted. The individuals who showed the most mechanical resistance in their jaws, those whose jaw structure was best at withstanding chewing forces, had the smallest, least developed chins in the sample. Even more remarkably, the study found that the jaws of young children, with their tiny, barely there chins, were relatively better at resisting certain types of mechanical forces than adult jaws with prominent chins. At age 3, when the chin is flat and nearly imperceptible, the jaw structure is more effective at handling some of the stresses created by vertical bending than it would be later in life. This is the exact opposite of what should occur if chins were evolving to strengthen the jaw against chewing forces. The team examined the data from multiple angles, looking for any evidence that mechanical forces from chewing contributed to chin development. They found nothing. As Nathan Holton stated plainly, the development of the chin doesn't seem to have anything to do with resistance to bending stresses. They're just not related. This wasn't a subtle finding or a matter of degree. The data showed no consistent link whatsoever between chin prominence and the ability to resist the mechanical forces of chewing. In some cases, the results showed that having a prominent chin actually made the jaw worse at resisting certain forces. Individuals with more prominent chins showed less resistance to mechanical stress, not more. This finding directly contradicted the fundamental assumption underlying the chewing hypothesis. If the chin had evolved to strengthen the jaw, individuals with bigger chins should have stronger jaws, not weaker ones. Instead, the data suggested that chin prominence was related to the overall geometry of facial development rather than mechanical forces. This conclusion was reinforced by sophisticated computer modeling studies using finite element analysis, a technique originally developed for engineering applications. This approach allows researchers to create detailed three-dimensional models of skulls and then simulate what happens to them under various forces. It's like having a virtual skull that you can subject to different types of stress and see exactly where the strain concentrates and how much deformation occurs. When researchers used finite element analysis to compare modern human jaws with and without chins, and to compare human jaws to those of Neanderthals, they made several important discoveries. A study by Groening and colleagues found that a vertical symphysis, the upright front portion of the jaw that's characteristic of modern humans, actually results in higher strains under wishboning forces, not lower strains as the chewing hypothesis would predict. This directly contradicted the mechanical hypothesis. If anything, the modern human chin configuration makes the jaw more vulnerable to these forces, not less. When researchers modified their computer models to test what would happen if you removed the chin from a modern human jaw, they found that strain patterns changed, but not in ways that suggested the chin was providing crucial structural support. Similarly, when they compared the stress patterns in modern human jaws to those in reconstructed Neanderthal jaws, they found that the modern human symphysis actually shows higher strains during certain types of loading, including the wishboning forces that some researchers had proposed the chin was meant to resist. These findings were particularly significant because Neanderthals had very powerful jaws and large teeth, and they certainly processed tough foods. Their tooth wear patterns and the injuries found on their skeletons suggest they lived hard lives in challenging environments, often grabbing and holding things with their teeth. Yet, Neanderthals didn't have chins. If chins were necessary for resisting chewing forces, Neanderthals should have needed them even more than modern humans do, given their robust jaws and presumed diet. The fact that they managed perfectly well without chins suggests the feature isn't crucial for jaw strength. Researchers also looked at what happens at a microscopic level when bone experiences mechanical stress. When you repeatedly stress a bone, tiny microcracks can form. The body responds to these microcracks by depositing new bone tissue, making the structure thicker and stronger in areas that experience the most stress. This is why weight-bearing exercises strengthen bones, and why the dominant arm of a tennis player develops thicker bone than the non-dominant arm. The chewing hypothesis assumed this same process would create the chin. Repeated chewing would cause microstress at the front of the jaw, stimulating bone deposition that would gradually build up the mental protuberance. But when researchers looked for evidence of this process, they didn't find it. The pattern of bone deposition in the chin region doesn't match what you'd expect if the structure were developing in response to mechanical stress from chewing. The bone grows forward and shapes itself into the distinctive chin form through a developmental process that appears to be independent of the forces acting on it. In fact, experimental evidence suggests that reducing mechanical stress doesn't prevent chin-like structures from forming. In 1969, a researcher named Reisenfeld conducted experiments with mice, extracting their continually growing front teeth and severing their muscles of mastication. This completely eliminated chewing forces and the mechanical stresses they create. Yet even without these forces, the mice developed protrusions in their lower jaw that resembled chins. This finding directly contradicted the chewing hypothesis. If eliminating all chewing forces could still produce a chin-like structure, then chewing forces couldn't be what created chins in the first place. The accumulating evidence from longitudinal growth studies, finite element analysis, and experimental animal studies all pointed in the same direction. The chin does not appear to be an adaptation for strengthening the jaw against chewing forces. As one of the researchers examining this question concluded, the chin is actually really bad in terms of preventing your jaw from breaking. What about the impact protection hypothesis? This idea faces several fundamental problems. First, for this to work as an evolutionary explanation, early humans would have had to experience facial impacts frequently enough that individuals with chins had a meaningful survival or reproductive advantage over those without. As one researcher pointed out, this would require that human beings would have to be hitting each other so often or must be the clumsiest animals alive for as long as necessary to generate that kind of adaptation. More fundamentally, the chin is structurally poorly designed for impact protection.
It concentrates force rather than dispersing it, making jaws more likely to break at the symphysis rather than less likely. The chin doesn't work like a car bumper or a helmet. When you get hit in the chin, the force transmits directly to the jaw joint and can easily cause fractures. If impact protection were the goal, you'd expect to see reinforcement distributed around the entire jaw, not concentrated in a forward-pointing knob.
The collapse of the mechanical hypotheses left researchers in an uncomfortable position. For more than a century, these explanations had seemed so obvious, so reasonable, that many scientists had simply accepted them without rigorous testing. Now that rigorous testing had been done, the hypotheses didn't just fail to be confirmed, they were actively contradicted by the evidence. Chins don't strengthen jaws against chewing forces. They might even make jaws slightly weaker in some respects. They don't effectively protect against impacts. Whatever the chin is for, it's not for eating or fighting. This left scientists with a profound puzzle. Evolution by natural selection is supposed to favor traits that improve survival and reproduction. Features that cost energy to build and maintain but provide no benefit should be selected against and gradually disappear. Yet here was a prominent, energetically costly feature that appeared only in modern humans, served no apparent mechanical function, and had persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. Something didn't add up. The failure of the mechanical hypotheses opened the door to alternative explanations. If the chin wasn't a direct adaptation for some mechanical function, what was it? Could it have evolved for some other purpose entirely? Or could it be that the chin wasn't really an adaptation at all, but rather an accident, a byproduct of other evolutionary changes? These questions would lead researchers in surprising new directions, challenging fundamental assumptions about how evolution works and what makes humans unique. Chapter 3. The Architectural Accident. The answer to this puzzle may lie in an unexpected place: the architecture of medieval cathedrals. In the late 1970s, evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould and geneticist Richard Lewontin published a now famous paper that would change how scientists think about adaptation. They borrowed a term from architecture called a spandrel. In cathedral architecture, when you build arches to support a dome, you inevitably create roughly triangular spaces between the side of each arch and the rectangular frame around it. These triangular spaces are spandrels. They weren't designed for any purpose. No architect sat down and said, "We need to create these triangular spaces." They simply appear as an unavoidable consequence of the geometry involved in placing rounded arches within rectangular frames. Architects through history often decorated these spandrels with elaborate paintings or mosaics, making them beautiful and visually important parts of the cathedral. A visitor might look up and assume the spandrels were intentionally designed as spaces for artwork, but that would be backwards. The spandrels exist because of the arches and the dome. The decoration came later. The space itself is a byproduct, not a design feature. Gould and Lewontin proposed that evolution works similarly. Not every observable feature of an organism is the product of natural selection acting directly on that feature. Some traits appear as inevitable consequences of other changes. These biological spandrels may later acquire functions or become important in other ways, but they didn't originate because they were useful. They originated as side effects. The concept challenged a tendency in evolutionary biology to assume that every trait must have been shaped by natural selection for a specific purpose. This way of thinking, sometimes called adaptationism, had dominated the field for decades. But Gould and Lewontin argued that evolution is messy. Bodies are integrated systems where changing one part necessarily affects other parts. Some features we observe are just the inevitable geometric or developmental consequences of evolution acting on something else entirely. Could the human chin be such a spandrel? Rather than assuming the chin must be an adaptation and then trying to figure out what it's adapted for, scientists decided to test the opposite idea, the null hypothesis, that the chin evolved through neutral processes without direct selection acting on it specifically.
A team led by Noreen von Kramenn-Taubadel at the University at Buffalo conducted one of the most comprehensive tests of this hypothesis. The researchers examined 532 skulls belonging to humans and 14 other species and subspecies of modern apes, including chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, orangutans, and gibbons. They took extraordinarily detailed measurements, recording 46 different distances between precise anatomical landmarks across the head and jaw, with 9 of these measurements specifically focused on the chin region.
They then mapped these measurements onto an evolutionary tree, showing how all these species are related. Using sophisticated statistical models, they calculated how quickly each trait changed along different branches of the tree. If a trait changes faster than you'd expect from random genetic drift alone, that's evidence of directional selection, meaning evolution was actively pushing that feature in a particular direction. If it changes more slowly than expected, that suggests stabilizing selection, where evolution is actively maintaining a certain form. If it changes at about the rate you'd expect from drift, that suggests selection isn't particularly acting on it one way or the other. What the researchers found was striking. Along most branches of the ape evolutionary tree, skull and jaw features changed slowly or remained stable. But along the branch leading from the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees up to modern Homo sapiens, changes happened dramatically faster, 77 times faster than the background rate of evolution in primates. This wasn't gradual drift. Something was under extraordinarily strong directional selection in the human lineage. The skull and jaw were being actively reshaped by evolutionary forces at a rate rarely seen in nature. But here's the crucial question. Was that something the chin itself, or was the chin a side effect of other changes? To find out, the researchers looked specifically at those 9 traits associated with the chin region. If the chin evolved as a direct adaptation, most or all of these traits should show strong evidence of directional selection. Instead, they found that only 3 of the 9 chin-related traits showed signs of direct selection. 3 others showed no significant selection at all. The remaining 3 showed what's called indirect selection, meaning they changed not because selection was acting on them directly, but because they're connected to other traits that were under selection. This pattern is exactly what you'd expect if the chin were a spandrel. The data suggested that natural selection was actively reshaping other parts of the skull and jaw, and the chin appeared as a geometric consequence of those other changes. As the researchers concluded, the chin is not a singularity, but rather the result of multiple changes in the relative position of different aspects of mandibular morphology. Or, as von Kramenn-Taubadel put it more bluntly, the chin evolved largely by accident. The spandrel hypothesis also helps explain puzzling specimens from the fossil record. The individuals from Kafza Cave in Israel, dated to around 90,000 years ago, are classified as anatomically modern humans based on many skeletal features. Yet several of these specimens lack the distinctive chin morphology found in later populations. If the chin were a crucial adaptation, its absence in otherwise modern humans would be difficult to explain. But if the chin is a spandrel, its variable appearance makes perfect sense. It marks populations where certain geometric rearrangements of the skull had or hadn't yet occurred, not populations that had or hadn't acquired some essential feature. So what were those other changes that created the chin as a byproduct? The evidence points to several major shifts in skull architecture that occurred during human evolution. First, there was increasing flexion of the cranial base, the platform of bone that forms both the roof of our faces and the floor of our brain case. This base bent more sharply downward near the temples, creating the distinctive rounded skull shape of modern humans. Second, the neurocranium, the part of the skull that houses the brain, expanded dramatically. Third, the lower face became less projecting and more retracted beneath the brain case. Fourth, the mandible became more gracile, meaning more lightly built, and shifted from a U-shaped form, like that seen in apes, to a more parabolic or curved form. So what were those other changes that created the chin as a byproduct? The evidence points to several major shifts in skull architecture that occurred during human evolution.
First, there was increasing flexion of the cranial base, the platform of bone that forms both the roof of our faces and the floor of our brain case. This base bent more sharply downward near the temples, creating the distinctive rounded skull shape of modern humans. Second, the neurocranium, the part of the skull that houses the brain, expanded dramatically. Third, the lower face became less projecting and more retracted beneath the brain case. Fourth, the mandible became more gracile, meaning more lightly built, and shifted from a U-shaped form, like that seen in apes, to a more parabolic or curved form.
These coordinated changes transformed the entire geometry of the human head. As the face became smaller and retracted beneath an expanding brain case, the upper part of the symphysis, the alveolar region that holds the teeth, moved backward. But the lower part of the symphysis, what we call the mental region, remained protruded or even extended forward. This created the inverted T shape that characterizes the human chin. Think of it as a matter of subtraction. The lower border didn't retreat at the same rate as the upper portions. What was left was a protrusion, a chin. Not because having a chin was useful, but simply because that piece of bone didn't get smaller as fast as everything around it did. This interpretation is supported by developmental evidence. Studies of how the chin forms in growing children show that it emerges through a specific pattern of bone growth. The alveolar region, the upper part of the symphysis, is sculpted through bone resorption, where tissue is broken down and removed. Meanwhile, the chin, the lower part, grows through bone deposition, where new tissue is added. These coordinated processes of removal and addition create the distinctive jutting chin of modern humans. As Nathan Holton, who conducted detailed biomechanical studies of chin development, described it, the developing face is like an expanding, shape-shifting, three-dimensional puzzle where different pieces move at different rates and in different directions. Crucially, this developmental pattern appears to be linked not to mechanical forces from chewing, but to spatial constraints in the developing face and throat. In both human infants and chimpanzee fetuses, researchers have documented a similar pattern. As the face develops, there's limited space in the oral cavity. The tongue is relatively large and needs room. The hyoid bone, a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat that anchors tongue muscles, needs to be positioned properly to allow swallowing and breathing. Activities like fetal breathing and swallowing create forces that help shape the developing symphysis as these structures arrange themselves. The shared developmental pattern between humans and chimpanzees is particularly revealing. Chimpanzee fetuses go through a stage where their symphysis becomes more vertical and develops a slight protrusion, though this is less pronounced than in humans, and the final adult form is quite different. The fact that both species show similar developmental changes suggests these changes arise from constraints that both species face, constraints related to fitting a large tongue and properly positioned hyoid bone into a relatively small space at the back of the oral cavity. This brings us to an important concept in evolutionary developmental biology called morphological integration. The skull and jaw aren't collections of independent parts that evolve separately. They're tightly integrated systems where components are linked genetically, developmentally, and functionally. When selection changes one part, other parts necessarily change too because they're connected. The skull sits on top of the spine, houses the brain, supports the face, contains the teeth, and provides attachment points for powerful muscles. All these functions constrain how it can be shaped. You can't just change the brain size without affecting the skull shape. You can't change the skull shape without affecting how the face attaches. You can't change the face without affecting the jaw. When researchers examined this integration, they found that the human chin fits perfectly into a pattern of coordinated changes across the whole skull. The flexion of the cranial base, the expansion of the brain, the reduction of the face, and the reshaping of the jaw all happen together as part of a coordinated transformation. The chin wasn't being selected for independently. It emerged as part of this integrated package of changes. Some researchers have pointed to specific aspects of this integration as particularly important for chin formation.
The reduction in tooth size, especially of the incisors and canines at the front of the mouth, shortened the alveolar region of the mandible. At the same time, bone deposition continued at the base of the symphysis. This combination gradually made the symphyseal angle more upright and created the forward projection we call a chin. Meanwhile, changes in the cranial base that flexed it more sharply moved the face backward and upward relative to the brain case, further emphasizing the relative forward position of the chin. All of these changes were happening simultaneously over hundreds of thousands of years. The chin didn't emerge in isolation. It emerged as one visible consequence of a wholesale remodeling of the human head. The chin shows up clearly in fossils from around 200,000 years ago, though some earlier specimens show hints of the developing feature. This timing corresponds with a period of rapid change in human skull morphology. The modern human cranial form was crystallizing, and the chin emerged during this transformative period not because it was being selected for, but because the geometric rearrangement of the skull made it inevitable.
This interpretation has profound implications for how we think about human uniqueness. The chin is distinctively human, easily visible, and definitional for our species in the fossil record. Yet it appears to emerge not through direct selection for its own sake, but as an unavoidable geometric consequence of other, more fundamental transformations. It's as unavoidable as the spandrels in a cathedral. Once you take an ape skull and reshape it through the coordinated changes described above, you necessarily get a chin. Understanding the chin as a spandrel rather than an adaptation changes how we interpret human evolution. It reminds us that not every distinctive feature was directly selected for, and that evolutionary change often produces unexpected consequences. The chin exists not because it solved some problem, but because the geometry of skull development made it inevitable once other changes occurred. It's a signature of our evolutionary transformation, written in bone. Chapter 4. Self-Domestication. The chin emerged as a byproduct, as we've seen, but a byproduct of what? The answer may lie in a profound behavioral transformation that began reshaping human society deep in our evolutionary past. Something happened to how our ancestors lived together, and this social revolution left its signature written in bone, including that small protrusion beneath your lower lip. For most of human evolutionary history, our ancestors lived in small, relatively isolated bands. Archaeological evidence suggests these groups were largely self-sufficient, maintaining territories and having limited contact with neighboring populations. This lifestyle wasn't unique to early humans. Many primate species organized themselves in similar ways. These small, isolated groups face certain pressures. Resources are limited. Conflicts over territory, food, and mates are common. In such environments, aggression and dominance often determine who succeeds reproductively. But at some point, a different pattern emerged. Human groups began forming wider social networks across the landscape. Instead of remaining isolated, they started regularly interacting with neighboring groups, not primarily as enemies, but as partners. They exchanged goods that had been manufactured or gathered hundreds of miles away. They shared innovations in tool-making techniques. They traded raw materials like high-quality stone for tool production. Perhaps most significantly, they exchanged mates, creating genetic links between populations that previously would have been separate.
Archaeological evidence for this shift appears in multiple forms. Burial sites from this period show grave goods that include shells from distant coastlines and stones from distant quarries, indicating extensive trade networks. The diversity of stone tool types increases, suggesting that groups were learning techniques from each other rather than developing everything independently. Cave paintings and carved figurines appear, demonstrating a shared symbolic culture that spanned large regions. Body ornaments made from shells, teeth, and carved bone become common. All of these changes point to human groups that were more connected, more communicative, and more cooperative than their predecessors had been. This social transformation had profound implications. In the older pattern of isolated, territorial groups, the most successful males were often the most aggressive and dominant. They defended territory through force. They competed intensely for mates. They had to be suspicious of strangers, ready to fight. But in the new pattern of networked groups with regular, peaceful contact, these traits became liabilities rather than advantages. A male who attacked visiting traders would jeopardize valuable exchange relationships. A male who couldn't cooperate with neighbors would miss out on innovations and alliances. A male who fought with every stranger he met would make his entire group vulnerable.
The males who succeeded in this new social environment were those who could tolerate each other, who were curious rather than hostile when meeting strangers, who could negotiate and cooperate rather than immediately resorting to aggression. They had to be inquisitive, interested in what others knew and what they had to offer. They needed to form alliances, work together on complex tasks, and maintain peaceful relationships even when tensions arose. These are fundamentally different behavioral traits than those favored in isolated competitive groups. This shift from isolation to cooperation, from suspicion to curiosity, from aggression to tolerance, represents a process that some researchers have called human self-domestication. The term might sound strange when applied to our own species. We typically think of domestication as something we do to other animals. But the process of domestication isn't really about humans controlling other species. It's about selection for tameness, for reduced aggression, for tolerance of close proximity to others. And that's exactly what appears to have happened to humans. We have strong evidence that behavioral selection can reshape anatomy through hormonal mechanisms. The most compelling example comes from a remarkable long-term experiment with silver foxes in Russia. In 1959, a Soviet scientist began a breeding project with wild foxes that had been captured from the Siberian wilderness. These foxes were intensely fearful and aggressive toward humans, as wild foxes naturally are. But the researcher had a specific goal: to breed foxes for tameness. In each generation, he selected only the tamest, most human-tolerant foxes to breed. He wasn't selecting for any particular physical traits, only for behavior. The foxes that were least aggressive toward humans, that showed the most tolerance and even friendliness, were the ones allowed to reproduce. Generation after generation, he continued this selection for a single behavioral trait, the ability to calmly tolerate human proximity. What happened was extraordinary. Within just a few generations, the fox's behavior transformed dramatically. They became friendly, sought human attention, and behaved much like domestic dogs. But here's what makes this relevant to the human chin. The fox's physical appearance also changed, even though no one was selecting for physical traits. Their skulls became shorter and wider. Their faces became less elongated. Their ears became floppier. Their tails began to curl. Some even developed patches of white fur. These physical changes appeared as automatic byproducts of selecting for behavioral tameness. When researchers examined the tamed foxes more closely, they found that the behavioral changes were accompanied by hormonal changes. The domesticated foxes had significantly lower levels of corticosteroids, hormones involved in stress responses and aggression. They also showed changes in the timing of their development, with certain juvenile features persisting longer into adulthood. The physical changes to their skulls appeared to result from these hormonal shifts. The hormones that regulate stress and aggressive behavior also influence how bones grow and develop. By selecting for calm, friendly behavior, the researchers had inadvertently selected for a different hormonal profile, and that different hormonal profile reshaped the skull. Could the same process have occurred in humans? The parallels are striking. Just as the Russian foxes were selected for tolerance and reduced aggression, early humans who formed cooperative social networks would have experienced selection for exactly these traits. Males who could tolerate other males, who were less prone to violence, who could cooperate effectively, would have had advantages in the new social environment. They would have better access to trade networks, more allies, more opportunities to learn new skills. Their groups would have been more stable and prosperous. And crucially, they would have had better reproductive success. In humans, one of the key hormones involved in aggressive and dominant behavior is testosterone. High testosterone levels are associated with competitiveness, territoriality, risk-taking, and aggression. These traits are useful in some environments, but problematic in others. In a small, isolated group where physical dominance matters, high testosterone might be advantageous. But in a large, interconnected society where cooperation and negotiation matter more, extremely high testosterone becomes a problem. Males with somewhat lower testosterone would be better at forming the kinds of peaceful, cooperative relationships that the new social structure required. If females began preferring males who were less aggressive and more cooperative, selecting mates who could successfully navigate the new social landscape, this would create evolutionary pressure for reduced testosterone levels in males. Over many generations, average testosterone levels could shift downward. And just as changing hormone levels reshaped the skulls of the Russian foxes, changing testosterone levels could reshape human skulls. The pattern of how this works is revealing. Testosterone influences the growth of the facial skeleton, particularly in males. Higher testosterone during development produces a larger, more projecting face with more prominent brow ridges and a more robust jaw. Lower testosterone produces a smaller, flatter face with reduced brow ridges and a more gracile jaw. The hormonal changes don't work through mechanical stress or use. They work by altering the developmental program itself, the fundamental instructions that govern how bone tissue grows and where it's deposited or removed. Importantly, this doesn't mean that individual humans today have dramatically lower testosterone than our ancestors did. The comparison is more subtle. Small shifts in average testosterone levels or in the timing of testosterone surges during development could produce significant changes in adult facial structure over evolutionary time. The process works through changing the trajectory of facial growth during childhood and adolescence, the periods when testosterone begins to reshape the skull into its adult form. Interestingly, the basic features that define the human chin are already present and well defined in human fetuses by at least the 5th month of gestation. This early appearance suggests that the chin is not something that develops in response to use or mechanical stress after birth, but rather is part of the fundamental developmental blueprint of the modern human skull. Long before a baby takes its first bite of solid food or speaks its first words, the chin is already there, encoded in the pattern of facial growth. The hormonal changes that accompanied behavioral domestication appear to have altered the developmental processes, shifting the geometry in ways that made the chin inevitable. The role of males in this transformation may have been particularly important. Sexual dimorphism, the physical differences between males and females, is often driven by male competition for mates. In species where males fight intensely for reproductive access, males tend to be much larger and more heavily built than females. They develop weapons like horns or antlers or massive muscles and teeth for fighting. Where male competition is less intense, sexual dimorphism decreases. Human sexual dimorphism in facial structure is relatively modest compared to many primates, suggesting that male-male competition was not as intense in human evolution as it is in, say, gorillas or orangutans. This reduced male competition makes sense in the context of the social transformation. As human groups became more connected and cooperative, the benefits of forming alliances and maintaining peace increased. Males who could work together, who could coexist without constant conflict, would be more successful than those who couldn't. This would select against the most extremely aggressive males and favor those with more moderate temperaments. Over time, this could reduce the hormonal signals associated with male-male competition, including testosterone. The timing of chin emergence in the fossil record corresponds with the period of expanding social networks and cultural elaboration. The archaeological record shows increasing evidence of long-distance trade, symbolic expression, and cultural transition during exactly this period. The physical transformation of the face paralleled the behavioral transformation of human society.
It's worth emphasizing that this wasn't a quick change. The transformation took thousands of generations, but it's relatively rapid in evolutionary terms, especially for such a dramatic reshaping of anatomy. The fact that significant changes occurred over this timescale suggests strong selection pressure, not just genetic drift or random change. Something was actively driving the evolution of smaller, more retracted faces, and the social transformation of human life provides a compelling explanation for what that something was. The domestication analogy, while imperfect, helps us understand the process. Just as the Russian foxes became tamer, friendlier, and more dog-like through selection over just a few dozen generations, humans became tamer, friendlier, and more cooperative through selection over thousands of generations. The foxes didn't domesticate themselves, but humans did, through the social structures they created and the mate choices they made. We selected ourselves for the ability to live together peacefully in large numbers, to cooperate across group boundaries, to tolerate and even welcome strangers. And in doing so, we reshaped our own faces.
Cultural attitudes about this transformation have shifted in interesting ways. Saying that you look like a Neanderthal's used to be an insult, implying brutishness or primitive appearance. These days, people are often proud when they find that they have Neanderthal DNA, viewing it as connection to a hardy, successful population. This shift reflects our growing understanding that Neanderthals were sophisticated, capable people, not the dim-witted brutes of earlier imagination. Yet they lacked chins, marking them as different from us in this distinctive way. The chin is evidence of our self-domestication, a visible marker of the transformation that made us modern humans not just anatomically, but behaviorally and socially as well. Understanding the chin in this light transforms it from a puzzling anatomical quirk into a profound statement about human nature. We are the cooperative ape, the species that succeeded by working together rather than fighting each other. We are the ape that built cultures spanning continents, that shared knowledge across generations, that created art and symbol and meaning. And we are the ape that, in becoming more peaceful and social, reshaped our own faces and gave ourselves chins. The small bump of bone beneath your lip is a testament to the power of cooperation, the signature of a species that domesticated itself into dominance not through strength or aggression, but through the ability to get along.
Chapter 5. An Unsolved Mystery. After more than a century of scientific investigation, countless papers published in prestigious journals, sophisticated biomechanical analyses, detailed developmental studies, and examination of hundreds of skulls, both living and fossilized, we find ourselves in a somewhat embarrassing position. We still don't really know why humans have chins. Not definitively, not with the kind of certainty that science typically demands before declaring a question answered. This isn't for lack of effort or intelligence on the part of researchers. Some of the brightest minds in anthropology, evolutionary biology, and biomechanics have devoted their careers to studying this seemingly simple feature. They've employed geometric morphometrics to quantify subtle shape variations across skulls. They've used finite element analysis to simulate mechanical stresses. They've sequenced ancient DNA to track genetic changes. And yet the chin remains what one researcher aptly called an enduring puzzle. The fact that we've ruled out several explanations doesn't mean we've found the right one. It just means we know what the answer isn't. Part of what makes this question so persistently difficult is a fundamental limitation in how we study evolution. The scientific method works by making predictions and testing them through observations or experiments. This approach has been enormously successful in science, but it runs into problems when you're trying to explain a unique event in evolutionary history.
The chin evolved exactly once, in one lineage, under one specific set of circumstances. There are no other instances to compare it to, no parallel evolution to help us identify the key factors. As one researcher noted, when we're looking at things that are uniquely human, we can't look to examples in other species the way we normally would in evolutionary biology.
This leaves us trying to reconstruct what happened based on limited evidence and without the ability to see whether similar circumstances would produce similar results. The absence of experimental options compounds this problem. We can't run experiments on human evolution. We can't create populations of early hominids and see whether certain conditions produce chins. The closest we can come is studying the development of chins in living humans, examining the fossil record, and drawing analogies to other species. But analogies have limitations. It's suggestive evidence, not proof. This methodological challenge reveals something important about the nature of historical sciences, like paleontology and evolutionary biology. When we study the past, we're not doing the same kind of science as a chemist running reactions in a laboratory. We're reconstructing events that happened once, long ago, and can never be repeated. We work with fragmentary evidence, trying to piece together what happened and why. Sometimes we succeed convincingly. Other times, as with the chin, we're left with uncertainty.
The philosophical dimension of this uncertainty matters more than you might think. Underlying the debate about chins is a deeper disagreement about how evolution works and what kinds of explanations we should accept. As one researcher observed, the chin is one of those rare phenomena in evolutionary biology that really exposes the deep philosophical differences between researchers in the field. These aren't just technical disagreements about data or methods. They reflect fundamentally different views about the nature of evolution itself. Some researchers approach evolution with what's sometimes called an adaptationist perspective. This view holds that natural selection is the primary driver of evolutionary change, and that most observable features of organisms are adaptations shaped by selection for specific functions. From this perspective, if a distinctive feature like the chin exists, there must be a reason. It must be good for something. Other researchers take a more pluralistic view. They emphasize that evolution is driven by multiple processes, not just natural selection. Random genetic drift, developmental constraints, historical contingency, and byproduct effects all play important roles. From this perspective, not every feature needs an adaptive explanation. Some things exist simply because of the constraints and accidents of evolutionary history. When these researchers look at the chin, they're comfortable concluding that it might not be an adaptation at all. These philosophical differences shape how researchers interpret the same evidence. When biomechanical studies show that the chin doesn't strengthen the jaw, an adaptationist might conclude that we just haven't identified the correct function yet. A pluralist might conclude that this is evidence the chin has no function, that it's a spandrel we should stop trying to explain in adaptive terms. Both are reasonable positions, but they lead to very different research programs. The debate extends even to how we should define the chin as a trait. A recent comprehensive review examined what researchers mean when they talk about the chin, and found striking disagreement. Some define it purely by external morphology, the visible bump. Others focus on internal bone structure. Still others emphasize developmental patterns or genetic factors. This isn't mere semantic quibbling. How you define a trait determines what you're trying to explain. The continued uncertainty has led some researchers to focus less on why the chin evolved and more on what the chin can tell us about how evolution works. Even if we never definitively answer the question of why humans have chins, the effort to answer it has taught us valuable lessons about evolution, development, and biological systems. The chin research has also demonstrated the limitations of adaptive thinking. For much of the 20th century, evolutionary biologists tended to assume that every feature had an adaptive explanation. The chin has forced researchers to take seriously the possibility that some features don't have functions, that they're byproducts or accidents. This more nuanced view of evolution is now widely accepted, but the chin played a role in that shift. Looking forward, what might finally resolve the mystery of the chin? Some researchers are optimistic that advances in developmental genetics will provide answers. If we could identify the specific genes and developmental pathways that control chin formation and understand how those genes and pathways evolved, we might be able to determine whether the chin was under direct selection or emerged as a byproduct.
Genome-wide association studies are beginning to provide this kind of information. Researchers have already identified several genomic regions associated with facial morphology, though the specific genetic architecture underlying chin formation remains incompletely understood. Ancient DNA offers another potential avenue. We now have genetic sequences not just from Neanderthals and Denisovans, but from various archaic human populations. As genomic techniques improve, it may become possible to identify the genetic differences between populations with and without chins, and to determine when and how the relevant genetic changes occurred. This could tell us whether the chin appeared suddenly through a few key mutations or gradually through many small changes. Improved fossil discoveries and dating techniques might also help. Every new specimen from the critical period between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago provides more information about how the transition occurred. Better resolution of the timing could help match the appearance of the chin to other changes in human biology and behavior, potentially revealing what evolutionary pressures were operating at that time. Advances in morphometric analysis are allowing researchers to quantify subtle shape variations with unprecedented precision. Three-dimensional scanning and computational methods can now capture thousands of data points across a skull, revealing patterns invisible to the naked eye. These techniques may help distinguish between different evolutionary scenarios by identifying exactly which aspects of facial geometry changed and in what sequence. Yet even with these technological advances, we may never have the kind of certainty that we'd like. Evolution is a historical process, and historical processes don't always leave clear evidence of their causes. We might identify all the genetic and developmental mechanisms that produce the chin without ever knowing for certain why those mechanisms evolved. In a way, this uncertainty is fitting. The chin, after all, seems to be a uniquely human feature, and humans are complicated. We're the products of a complex evolutionary history involving changes in diet, locomotion, brain size, social organization, and culture, all interacting and influencing each other in ways that are difficult to disentangle. Perhaps it's appropriate that one of our most distinctive features resists simple explanation. The enduring mystery of the chin also reminds us of how much we still have to learn about ourselves. We like to think we understand human evolution, that we figured out where we came from and how we got here. But a small bump of bone at the bottom of our faces, something so ordinary that we barely notice it, continues to puzzle the experts. If we can't definitively explain the chin after more than a century of trying, what else about our evolution remains mysterious? For working scientists, the unsolved puzzle of the chin is both frustrating and exciting. Frustrating because the answer seems like it should be knowable. Exciting because major unsolved problems are what drive science forward. They're opportunities to develop new methods, test new ideas, and potentially discover something unexpected. As one researcher noted, perhaps understanding the chin will reveal some unexpected insight into what it means to be human. For the rest of us, the mystery of the chin offers a different kind of lesson. It's a reminder that we shouldn't mistake current explanations for final truths. The history of chin research is littered with confident explanations that turned out to be wrong. The fact that we've ruled out several explanations is progress, but it doesn't mean the explanation we currently favor is necessarily correct. The chin also serves as a useful antidote to oversimplified narratives about evolution. Popular accounts of human evolution often present it as a straightforward story of progress, with each change serving a clear purpose in making us more successful. But the chin suggests that evolution is messier than that. Sometimes features appear for reasons that have nothing to do with their current form or function. Evolution is tinkerer and opportunist, not an engineer working from a master plan. When you touch your chin today, you're touching a piece of your evolutionary history, but it's a piece whose meaning remains uncertain. That small bump of bone connects you to ancestors who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. It marks you as a member of Homo sapiens, distinguishing you from every other species that has ever lived.
It may tell a story about cooperation and social living, or about brain expansion and facial reduction, or about developmental constraints and geometric necessity, or perhaps about all of these things together in ways we haven't fully untangled. The uncertainty surrounding the chin doesn't diminish its significance. If anything, the enduring puzzle makes it more fascinating. We carry around on our faces a mystery that the best scientists in the world haven't solved, a reminder that even the most familiar and seemingly simple things about ourselves can harbor deep questions. The chin stands as a small but persistent challenge to our understanding, a question mark at the bottom of our faces, waiting for the insight or evidence that might finally explain it. Until then, we can appreciate it for what it clearly is, a uniquely human feature, a marker of our species, and one of evolution's most intriguing puzzles. So what have we learned about the humble chin? That it's uniquely ours, shared by no other creature past or present. That the century-old explanation about strengthening our jaws turned out to be wrong. That it likely emerged not because it was useful, but as an architectural accident, a byproduct of our faces becoming smaller and our brains larger. And perhaps most intriguingly, that it may be a signature of our self-domestication, evidence that we evolved to be less aggressive and more cooperative, fundamentally reshaping our skulls in the process. Yet, despite more than a century of investigation, the chin remains an unsolved mystery. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Sometimes the most ordinary things about ourselves, the features we never think twice about, turn out to harbor the deepest questions about who we are and where we came from. Thank you for listening.